The year was 1820, in the wealthy city of Natchez, Mississippi. In the sweltering heat of the sugar fields, one man stood over the fire of his forge. His name was Ezekiel, an enslaved blacksmith, forced to shape the very chains that bound his people. But in the silence of his hammer strike, he prepared a different fate, not for the enslaved, but for the man who held the whip. This is his story. Like, share, and subscribe for more forgotten American history. If you had stepped into Natchez in the early 1800s, you would have seen wealth everywhere. Grand mansions stood along the Mississippi River, their white columns gleaming in the sunlight. Steamboats puffed smoke as they carried cotton and sugar down the river, filling the pockets of planters with gold. Merchants sold fine clothes, imported wines, and polished furniture. Natchez was, by some accounts, one of the richest cities in America. But beneath this glittering surface lay a far darker reality. The wealth of Natchez was not born from hard work or honest trade. It was built on the backs of enslaved men, women, and children. Their sweat soaked the soil, their cries echoed in the cane fields, and their lives were traded like coin. For every grand plantation house on the bluffs, there were dozens of cabins in the shadows, where families lived under constant fear of the whip. Sugar was called white gold. It brought enormous wealth to the South, but it was also one of the most brutal crops to cultivate. Planting, cutting, and grinding cane was backbreaking work. The blades were sharp, the sun unforgiving, and the pace merciless. Overseers demanded endless hours of labor. Every stalk of cane carried the sting of blood. Those who faltered were punished. Those who resisted were crushed. And yet, in the heart of this system, some enslaved men were forced into roles that gave them skills beyond the field. Among them were blacksmiths' men, whose hands shaped iron and fire into tools, weapons, and chains. They worked at the forges, separate from the rows of cane, their faces lit by flames that never died. One of these men was Ezekiel to the white planters. He was simply another piece of property valuable. Yes, because his skill kept the plantation running. But to the enslaved around him, Ezekiel was something more. His forge was not just a place of labor. It was a place of whispers, of hidden strength, of a fire that could not be extinguished. Day after day, Ezekiel bent over the anvil. His hammer struck rhythmically, steady as a heartbeat. He made plows for the fields, horseshoes for the stables, hinges for the barns, and nails for the mansion doors. He also made chains. Heavy chains meant to hold men and women who dared to run. Shackles meant to bind ankles and wrists. Locks that clamped down on freedom. Every time he struck the iron, he knew what he was making. Every time he quenched the hot metal in water, steam rising like smoke, he felt the weight of it in his chest. The overseer would nod in approval, satisfied with Ezekiel's work. But inside, Ezekiel's heart ached. His hammer was a tool of oppression. His forge was a prison of fire. Yet there was something about being a blacksmith that gave him a kind of silent power. Unlike field hands, Ezekiel had access to tools, hammers, files, tongs, chisels. He knew the secrets of iron, how to bend it, how to harden it, how to shape it to his will. The overseer thought nothing of it. To him, Ezekiel was just another laborer doing his job. But in truth, Ezekiel was learning. He was watching. He was waiting. The enslaved whispered among themselves that blacksmiths were dangerous men. They knew too much. They worked with fire, the same fire that could destroy. They handled chains, the same chains that could break. In Ezekiel's silence, they sensed something, an ember of defiance glowing beneath the ashes. Natchez itself was a city of contradictions. On one hand, its citizens spoke of refinement, of Southern honor, of hospitality. On the other, they lived by the whip, the chain, and the auction block. They justified it all with smooth words and cruel lies, saying slavery was necessary, that it was natural, even ordained. But men like Ezekiel knew the truth. Slavery was nothing but theft of labor, of dignity, of life itself. And so the city thrived. Its streets filled with laughter and music, its markets bustling with trade. Yet just beyond the fine houses and shops, the sugar mills ground relentlessly, chewing up cane and spitting out profit, while enslaved bodies bent under the weight of it all. This was the world Ezekiel lived in, a world of wealth built on pain, of beauty shadowed by cruelty, a world where his hammer rang out every day, shaping the very instruments of bondage. But as the years passed, and as the overseer's cruelty deepened, Ezekiel's silence began to shift. The forge that once bound him would one day become his weapon. The forge was Ezekiel's world. It was not a place of freedom, but it was a place of fire. And fire had a way of teaching a man patience. Each morning, while the field hands trudged out to the cane rows under the overseer's watchful eye, Ezekiel was led to the smithy. The air there was no kinder. The Mississippi sun still beat down, and the fire from the forge only added to the heat. Sweat clung to his skin from dawn until dusk. His arms, scarred from sparks and burns, carried the weight of years at the anvil. To the overseer, Ezekiel was useful. Every plantation needed a blacksmith. Without him, the tools would dull, the wagons would break, the plows would split, and the sugar mill would stop grinding. Iron was the skeleton of the plantation, and Ezekiel was the man who kept that skeleton alive. He struck the anvil with rhythm, each clang echoing across the yard. The sound was steady, almost like music. But this was not music of joy. It was the slow, relentless song of survival. His hammer shaped horseshoes, plowshares, nails, and hinges. The master might look upon his fine gates and say, "Strong work." The overseer might hold a new set of shackles and nod with satisfaction. But Ezekiel knew the truth. His hands were forced to build the tools that chained his people, and that truth weighed on him heavier than the iron itself. Every link of a chain he hammered shut was a reminder. He had seen men brought in from the fields, wrists raw from iron, ankles swollen from shackles. He had seen mothers dragged from cabins, bound in the very cuffs he had been ordered to make. Each time his chest tightened. Each time the fire in the forge seemed to roar louder in his ears. Yet Ezekiel learned something as the years passed. Working with iron taught him more than obedience. It taught him control. He knew how to temper steel, how to heat it just enough to bend, but not enough to break. He learned which hammers to use for shaping curves, which tongs to grip small pieces, which chisels to cut through stubborn bars. He learned how locks worked, how pins fell into place, how hinges turned smoothly. The overseer saw nothing dangerous in this. But for Ezekiel, every strike, every lesson in iron was a lesson in patience, precision, and possibility. The enslaved men and women on the plantation often watched Ezekiel with a mixture of awe and sorrow. Awe, because he could command fire and bend iron to his will. Sorrow, because his gift was trapped in the service of their captors. Some whispered that men like him could never truly be broken. "A blacksmith has fire in his hands," one of the older men once said in hushed tones. And fire always finds a way. Ezekiel never spoke of rebellion, not openly. His silence was both shield and sword. He understood the overseer's eyes were always watching, ears always listening. A careless word, a whispered plan, could mean a whipping post or worse. So Ezekiel let his hammer speak for him. He let his silence protect him. But inside, thoughts grew like sparks waiting to catch flame. He was different from the field hands. Their world was cane and earth. Their rebellion was in slowing their pace, in singing songs of sorrow that carried hidden meaning. Ezekiel's rebellion was quieter still, buried deep inside the strike of his hammer. He was a man who could not be stripped of skill. No whip could erase his knowledge of iron. No chain could erase his memory of locks and keys. At night, when the forge cooled and the others lay exhausted in their cabins, Ezekiel would sit in the dim glow of dying embers. He would look at the tools hanging neatly on the wall: tongs, hammers, chisels, files. Tools that the overseer thought of only as instruments of work. Ezekiel saw something else. He saw weapons. He saw escape. He saw justice. The irony was sharp. The overseer trusted him with fire, iron, and blades, thinking Ezekiel too broken to ever use them against him. But Ezekiel was not broken. His silence was not submission. It was waiting. Day after day, he built what the master demanded. But in his mind, each chain he forged became a lesson in how chains could be undone. Each lock he fashioned became a study in how locks could be picked or turned against the very men who ordered them. Each hammer strike whispered a truth only he could hear. Iron does not belong only to the master. It can belong to me. In the shadows of the smithy, where sparks flew and flames licked the walls, Ezekiel's quiet rebellion grew. No one saw it. No one suspected. To the overseer, he was just another slave, silent, steady, obedient. But behind his silence burned the heat of iron and the memory of every chain he had ever made. And one day, he would turn that silence into action. Every plantation had one. If the master was the mind of the operation, the overseer was the whip hand. He was the man who made sure the fields never stopped moving, who kept the enslaved bent low under the sun, who carried punishment like a badge of honor. On Ezekiel's plantation, the overseer was a man of harsh words and harsher blows. He was not rich, not refined like the planters who lived in the mansion above the fields. Overseers were often poor whites, men who had little property of their own, but found power in lording over others. Their authority came from cruelty. Their pride came from fear. This overseer carried a long whip of braided leather. Its crack could be heard across the rows of cane, slicing the air with a sound that made children tremble. He wore a pistol at his side, though he rarely needed to fire it. His real weapon was terror, and terror needed no bullets. From morning until night, he prowled the fields. If he saw a man slow his swing of the machete, the whip cracked. If a woman stumbled under the weight of her bundle, he cursed and struck. He barked orders with a voice that seemed to scrape the skin. He reminded the enslaved, day after day, that they were not free, that any sign of weakness would be punished without mercy. Ezekiel saw him often. The smithy stood close enough to the fields that the sounds of the overseer's rage drifted in with the wind, the cries of the whipped, the curses of the overseer, the dull thud of blows. Sometimes the overseer himself came to the forge. He brought broken shackles and demanded new ones. He brought bent blades and ordered them straightened. He brought wagon wheels and insisted they be fixed before sunset. He treated Ezekiel as he treated the others, with scorn, with suspicion, with cruelty disguised as authority. He never thanked Ezekiel for his skill. To him, Ezekiel's talent was not a gift, it was property. There were days when the overseer lingered in the smithy longer than he needed to. He would stand in the doorway, whip coiled in his hand, watching Ezekiel work. Sometimes he mocked him. "You're a quiet one," he'd say. "Too quiet. But I reckon that's why you last. Keep your head down, do what you're told, and maybe you'll live to see another harvest." The words slid like oil across iron, cold and slick. Ezekiel never answered. He only struck the hammer, steady, steady, steady. But silence is not always obedience. Sometimes silence is rage too deep for words. There was one day that seared itself into Ezekiel's memory. A boy, no older than 12, stumbled in the cane. His arms were thin, his body too small for the heavy load he carried. The overseer saw him fall and strode over, whip uncoiling like a snake. Before the boy could rise, the whip came down. Once, twice, a third time. The boy's cries echoed across the fields, sharp and piercing. Ezekiel, from the smithy, froze at the sound. His hammer paused mid-swing. His jaw clenched. He stared at the red-hot iron glowing on the anvil, his mind burning hotter still. He could not run out there. To interfere meant death. But in that moment, he felt something change inside him. The fire of the forge no longer belonged only to the overseer's demands. It belonged to his anger. The cruelty did not stop with children. Women were not spared, nor the elderly. The overseer believed fear was stronger than compassion, and he fed that belief daily. To him, the enslaved were tools, not people. And tools, in his eyes, only worked when struck hard enough. What the overseer never saw, what he could not imagine, was that his very cruelty was sharpening something else. Just as Ezekiel's hammer shaped iron, the overseer's whip was shaping Ezekiel's resolve. With each lash across another's back, with each scream that tore the air, Ezekiel's silence grew heavier. Not the silence of submission, but the silence of a storm gathering on the horizon. The overseer thought he had broken the enslaved. He thought the blacksmith was just another quiet servant of the forge. But what he never understood was this: silence can be the deepest form of defiance. Ezekiel's hammer kept striking. His chains kept forming. But his heart was no longer making chains for others. He was imagining the day when iron would no longer belong to the overseer. And in his imagination, he began to see something the overseer never dreamed of. The day when the whip would fall silent, and the man who carried it would learn the weight of iron himself. For years, Ezekiel had carried his silence like armor. He worked the forge, kept his head down, and endured. He had seen cruelty before too much of it. He had seen men whipped until their backs were raw. He had seen women dragged away, their cries echoing long after night fell. He had even seen death, sudden and brutal, when a man dared to resist. Through it all, Ezekiel's hammer kept striking. His silence never broke. But every man has a moment when silence can no longer hold. For Ezekiel, that moment came one humid afternoon in the cane fields. The day had started like any other. The sun blazed overhead, the air so heavy with heat it seemed to smother every breath. Ezekiel was in the smithy hammering iron, the sound ringing out steady and sharp. From the fields beyond, he could hear the dull rhythm of machetes cutting cane, the shuffle of weary feet. The overseer's barked commands. Then came a scream. It was different this time, not the cry of a boy, not the groan of a man, but the sharp, desperate wail of a woman. Ezekiel's hammer froze in mid-strike. His chest tightened. He stepped to the doorway of the smithy and looked out. There, in the sweltering rows of cane, the overseer stood over a woman. She was small, bent from years of labor, her dress torn and clinging to her sweat-soaked body. She had stumbled while carrying a bundle of cane, her legs giving way under the weight. The overseer towered above her, whip uncoiled in his hand, eyes blazing with rage. It was Naomi, Ezekiel's sister. She was the only family he had left on the plantation. Their mother had been sold years earlier. Their father worked to death in the fields. Naomi was all that remained of his blood, and she was everything to him. The whip cracked once, striking across her back. She cried out, her body trembling as she tried to rise. The whip cracked again, sharper, crueler. The overseer shouted at her to move faster, to carry her weight like the others. But Naomi could not. She was too tired, too broken. Ezekiel gripped the doorway, his knuckles white. His heart pounded like the forge hammer against iron. He wanted to run to her, to throw himself between her and the whip. But he knew what that would mean. A man who struck or defied the overseer did not live to see another sunrise. So he stood frozen, rage boiling inside him as the whip fell a third time. Naomi's scream tore through him like fire. That night, Ezekiel could not sleep. He sat in the forge long after the others had gone to their cabins. The fire glowed low, casting shadows on the walls. His sister's cries echoed in his mind. His chest burned with shame for standing still, with fury for her suffering. With a weight that pressed heavier than any chain, the overseer thought he had shown power. But in truth, he had lit a fuse. Ezekiel stared into the flames, and in their glow, he saw not chains for the enslaved, but chains for the oppressor. He picked up a length of iron and placed it in the fire. Sparks flew as the metal heated, turning red, then white-hot. He hammered it slowly, deliberately, shaping it into shackles. But these were not like the ones he had made before. These were stronger, heavier, crafted with care, not for the overseer's approval, but for Ezekiel's purpose. Each strike of the hammer was different now. It was no longer the rhythm of forced labor. It was the rhythm of vengeance. His silence had broken, not in words, but in action. As he worked, he thought of Naomi. He thought of her bent beneath the overseer's blows, her body shaking, her voice crying out. He thought of all the others who had suffered under that whip. He thought of the boy, the elderly men, the mothers who had lost children at the auction block. All of it flowed into the iron. All of it gave weight to his hammer. By the time the fire dimmed and the night deepened, Ezekiel had finished. On the workbench lay a pair of shackles, darker than the night itself. They were not meant to bind the innocent. They were meant for the guilty. Ezekiel sat in the quiet forge, breathing heavy, sweat dripping down his face. For the first time in his life, he felt the iron in his hands belonged to him, not to the master, not to the overseer, but to him. It was his fire now, his hammer, his chains. And soon it would be the overseer's turn to feel their weight. The cane fields lay silent beneath the Mississippi moon. Crickets sang in the grass, and the river, far in the distance, rolled dark and slow. Most of the cabins were quiet now. Slaves, worn from the day's toil, lay in restless sleep, their bodies broken, but their spirits still breathing. But in the smithy, the fire still burned. Its glow leaked through the cracks in the wooden walls, a dull orange heartbeat in the night. Inside, Ezekiel worked the bellows with steady hands, feeding the flames as if they were alive. The forge roared, iron hissed. Sparks rose and vanished into the dark. On the workbench lay the shackles he had made, heavy, cold, waiting. Ezekiel's face was shadowed, his eyes fixed on the fire. His jaw was set, his muscles taut, his silence sharper than any blade. He had prepared the trap carefully, knowing the overseer's habits, knowing the hunger for control that drove him to check the smithy even in the dead of night. And sure enough, the sound came, boots crushing gravel, slow, deliberate. Approaching through the stillness, the overseer. Ezekiel did not look up at first. He kept the bellows pumping, kept the fire alive, as if nothing were different. His hammer lay close at hand, its weight familiar, steady. The iron in the forge glowed white-hot, the air filled with heat and smoke. The door creaked open. The overseer stepped inside, his shadow falling across the floorboards. His whip dangled at his side, coiled like a serpent. "You still workin', boy?" His voice carried that mocking edge, that cruel blend of suspicion and arrogance. "Can't never stop hittin' that iron, can you?" Ezekiel did not answer. He kept his back turned, shoulders rising and falling in rhythm with the bellows. Silence was his mask, the overseer's favorite mark of obedience. But tonight, silence had another meaning. The overseer moved closer, boots thudding on the wooden floor. He leaned against the workbench, eyeing the tools, the fire, the shackles gleaming faintly in the glow. "What's this?" he muttered, lifting one of the shackles. He weighed it in his hand, smirking. You mackin' these stronger now, eh? Good. Gonna need plenty for the next shipment. His laugh was sharp, cutting. Ezekiel turned then, slow and deliberate. His eyes met the overseer's, calm but burning deep. For the first time he spoke. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of years. "They are strong," he said. "Strong enough to hold even a man like you." The overseer frowned, taken off guard. He opened his mouth to reply, but Ezekiel moved first. With a sudden strike, he swung the hammer, not at the overseer's head, but at his wrist. The whip fell from his grasp. As pain shot through him, the overseer staggered back, shouting in rage, but Ezekiel was already on him. He seized the man's arm, twisted it behind his back, and drove him down against the workbench with a force born of years at the forge. The shackles clanged as Ezekiel snapped them shut around the overseer's wrists. The iron bit deep, chains rattling as the man struggled, cursed, spat. "You dare!" The overseer bellowed, thrashing like a beast. But Ezekiel's strength held firm. His silence was gone now, replaced by a grim fire that no lash could quench. The forge roared louder, sparks flying as if the flames themselves knew what was coming. Ezekiel shoved the overseer to the ground, locking his ankles in iron. The overseer kicked, cursed, promised death 100 ways. But every promise only echoed against the walls, swallowed by the fire's hungry breath. For the first time in his life, Ezekiel stood above the overseer, not beneath. He watched the man's fury twist into something else. Fear. The chains clinked with every struggle, but they held. They were Ezekiel's chains, forged by his own hand, shaped by his silence, hardened by his rage, and now they bound the man who had wielded them for so long. Ezekiel stood over him, chest heaving, sweat pouring down his brow. The hammer hung loose at his side, heavy but no longer just a tool. It was a weapon. It was justice. The overseer's eyes darted, wide, frantic. He pulled, kicked, roared. But the shackles did not yield. They were stronger than him, stronger than the whip, stronger than fear. Ezekiel looked down, his voice steady as the forge itself. "You will feel what we have felt. You will learn the weight of iron." And with that, the trap was sprung. The overseer was no longer master of this night. He was prey. The sugar mill loomed in the night like a giant beast, its wooden gears creaking, its iron teeth grinding. By day, it was the overseer's weapon of profit, devouring stalk after stalk of cane, pressing the sweet juice from green stalks with merciless force. By night, it stood like a waiting monster, its shadows stretching across the ground, its mouth never truly closed. Ezekiel dragged the shackled overseer toward it, each step heavy with purpose. The chains clinked against the dirt, the overseer cursing and spitting, thrashing like a trapped animal. But the iron held. Ezekiel's hand never faltered. His strength was not just of muscle. Now it was of rage, of memory, of justice long denied. The overseer's voice rose in fury. "You'll hang for this, boy. They'll skin you alive. They'll burn you till there's nothing left." But Ezekiel did not answer. His silence now was not submission. It was final judgment. The night air was thick with the scent of cane and smoke. A few distant lamps flickered in the quarters, but no one stirred. Perhaps some heard the clatter of chains, the muffled shouts, the groan of the mill's timbers, but they stayed in their cabins, hearts pounding, breaths held. They knew something was happening. They knew justice was moving. At the mouth of the mill, Ezekiel stopped. The great rollers gleamed faintly in the firelight, wet with sugar juice, glistening like teeth. The gears groaned as the water wheel turned, steady and unfeeling. Powered by the endless pull of the river. The overseer's curses faltered. His voice cracked. For the first time, fear crept into his words. Wait, Ezekiel. "You don't want this. You listen to me." But Ezekiel remembered Naomi's screams. He remembered the boy whipped until he collapsed. He remembered the men broken in the fields, the women dragged to the quarters at night, the countless souls crushed beneath this man's lash dot, and he remembered the chains. Always the chains. He stepped closer, dragging the overseer with him, until the man's face was inches from the rollers. The overseer struggled wildly now, his arrogance shattered, his words desperate. Don't put me in there. I'll stop. I swear it, I'll stop. The chains rattled louder as Ezekiel lifted him, forcing him toward the mill. The overseer screamed, a high, tearing sound that broke through the night dot, and then the gears caught, the iron teeth bit dot. The overseer's cries turned into a howl of terror as the rollers began to take him, dragging him forward. His body twisted, the chains pulling tighter, the iron singing its final song. The sound of the mill swallowed his screams. The grinding of wood and iron, the crushing of flesh and bone, mingled into one terrible harmony. It was not quick. The machine was slow, relentless, chewing him the way it had chewed countless stalks of cane. Ezekiel did not turn away. His face was stone, his eyes fixed on the man who had wielded so much cruelty. This was not vengeance for one day. It was vengeance for years, for generations, for every whip crack, every broken chain, every cry lost in the fields dotted last. The overseer's voice fell silent. The mill kept grinding, the river kept turning, but the beast had finished its meal. Ezekiel stood alone in the dark, the chains slack in his hands, stained now not with rust or sweat, but with blood. The firelight flickered across his face, casting him in shadow, making him look not just like a man, but like a figure carved from the iron itself. He had fed the master of chains to the master of the mill. And in that act, he had broken something that could never be mended. The night was still again, save for the steady groan of the mill and the quiet hum of insects in the fields. Ezekiel stood there for a long time, his chest rising and falling, his hands trembling with the weight of what he had done. Somewhere, deep inside him, he felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter, because justice had been served. Heavier, because he knew what came next. The plantation would not stay silent forever. Come morning, the master would discover the overseer's fate. The hounds would be set loose. The riders would search. And they would come for Ezekiel Dot, but for this moment, for this night, Ezekiel was free, not in body, but in spirit, and no man, no chain, no lash could ever take that away again. The first light of dawn crept slowly across Natchez, spilling pale gold over the plantation. The air was thick with the scent of cane, earth, and smoke. Birds stirred cautiously, sensing that something had shifted in the night. Inside the cabins, enslaved men and women awoke to whispers. Some had heard the clatter, the screams, or the grinding of the sugar mill. No one dared speak too loudly, but the story traveled quickly. Ezekiel had acted. He had turned chains against the man who had wielded them for years, that the overseer was gone. Some could hardly believe it. Some thought it impossible. The overseer was feared by everyone, even the brave. And yet, the shackles he had once used to strike and terrorize now bound him to the mill in the darkness of the night, a silent testimony to the power of fire. Iron and resolve out from the cabins. Women peeked through small windows, children clinging to them, eyes wide with awe. Men whispered, heads bent close together, voices trembling with both fear and admiration. "Did you hear?" One murmured, "Ezekiel." He did it. The master would arrive soon, the news would spread, and chaos would follow. But for now, there was only silence and the hum of the river, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Ezekiel stood in the smithy, the forge cold now, the embers dim. He had stayed the night, waiting until he was certain the overseer's fate was sealed. His hands were black with soot and streaked with blood. He looked at the shackles lying empty on the workbench, feeling the weight of them even now. He did not feel pride, not in the way the overseer had imagined. What Ezekiel felt was something heavier, the truth of what it meant to be free, even for a moment, even in a world still built on chains dotting the fields. The enslaved glanced toward the smithy, eyes wide, lips pressed together to keep from shouting. They understood something profound without words, that a man could rise, quietly, in the shadows, and turn the tools of oppression against those who had used them. That courage could be forged, hammered into shape, and wielded with precision. By midday, rumors had reached the master. He arrived in a flurry of anger and disbelief, riding fast along the river road, followed by a small group of overseers from neighboring plantations. They found the sugar mill quiet, the teeth still glistening with the horrors of the night, and the sound of the river flowing like judgment. Questions flew. Shouts rang out. No one had answers. Only the enslaved shook their heads, casting knowing glances, silent in the understanding that Ezekiel had acted, that justice, however dark, had been served. Some of the older enslaved men muttered that this had been coming for years. "The boy has fire in his hands," they said. "He's always had it. We just didn't know when it would burn." Ezekiel watched from the smithy doorway, his face hidden in the shadow of the roof. He did not move. He did not speak. He let them look, let them search, let them wonder. The forge had taught him patience, and patience was still his ally. Yet he knew the day would not remain silent forever. The master would demand retribution. The plantation would erupt in fear and anger. Ezekiel would have to choose: flee, hide, or face the wrath that his justice had earned. But in that dawn, before the chase, before the punishment, before the fear, there was a moment that belonged only to the enslaved. A moment when whispers carried hope. A moment when the people bent under chains realized that the chains could be broken. And Ezekiel, standing silent yet unbowed, felt that hope ripple through him as well. He was still a slave in body, still a man hunted by those who would see him dead. But in spirit and resolve, he was unshackled. And the plantation wealthy, proud and cruel, had learned, in the quiet hum of a Mississippi morning, that even a single man could turn chains against the master. Ezekiel vanished from the plantation soon after that night. No one could say for certain where he went. Some claimed he fled into the swamps along the Mississippi, moving like a shadow between the cypress trees and riverbanks, a ghost carried on the wind. Others whispered that he had been caught and punished, though no one could confirm such a tale. What mattered more than the truth, however, was the story itself. The story traveled quickly, whispered from cabin to cabin, carried from field to field. Men and women bent beneath the weight of labor spoke of a blacksmith who had dared to use the tools of the master against him. Children repeated the tale in hushed tones, eyes wide with wonder and fear. Even those who had never seen the event felt its power. To the enslaved, Ezekiel became more than a man. He became a symbol, a figure of quiet resistance, a reminder that no amount of chains, no amount of cruelty, could fully contain a spirit fueled by justice and patience. "You hear about Ezekiel?" they would murmur. "He's got fire in his hands, stronger than any whip. Even the overseer's chains could not hold him." Not really. The master and neighboring planters, meanwhile, sought answers in panic and rage. How had one enslaved man done what he did? How had he turned the tools of labor, the instruments of control, against the very men who had ruled him? Fear seeped into their wealth, into their daily routines, into every corner of their plantations. They increased patrols, questioned every servant, and tightened the lash in hopes of deterring others. But the story could not be undone. Among the enslaved, it was different. The tale spread courage as quickly as it spread fear. Men whispered of strategy, of patience, of waiting for the right moment. Women told stories of survival and quiet defiance, of standing strong while the world tried to break them. And in every telling, Ezekiel's figure loomed large, not just a man, but a force, a lesson in cunning and bravery. Years later, when the Mississippi sun beat down on the sugar fields and the river carried its heavy scent past the bluffs, parents would tell children about the blacksmith who had done the impossible. And though the details blurred with time, the essence remained. A man who refused to bend under cruelty, who turned chains against the man who had used them to break others. Ezekiel's story became a caution to overseers, a spark to the enslaved, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of Natchez, courage could take root and grow. It was whispered that wherever he went, he carried the knowledge of the forge, the patience of years spent in fire, and the resolve to never bow to oppression again. Some claim he joined networks of freedom seekers, moving along rivers and through swamps, guiding others toward safety. Others say he simply disappeared, a shadow in the night, leaving behind only the echo of iron and the memory of justice done. The legend served a purpose far beyond vengeance. It reminded the enslaved that resistance could take many forms, not always open revolt, not always loud. Sometimes it was hidden, slow, patient. A spark in a forge, a whispered plan, a chain turned against the oppressor. Even decades later, when the plantations of Natchez were quiet and the river carried the weight of history in its currents, the story of Ezekiel lived on. It became part of the collective memory, passed down through families, a flickering flame of defiance in a world built to snuff it out. The enslaved learned something essential. From him, courage is not always immediate. It is forged in silence, tested in fire, and revealed when the time is right. And while the overseers thought they controlled every chain, every hammer, every man, they could not control the spirit that refused to yield. Ezekiel of Natchez became more than a man. He became a lesson, a warning, a story carried on the wind, whispered through the cane fields, remembered whenever iron met fire and chains rattled. And though history may not remember him in books or official records, in the hearts of those who carried the story, Ezekiel's fire never went out. Ezekiel's story did not end with chains or fire. It did not end with the sugar mill or the overseer's screams. It continued in whispers, in lessons, in the quiet knowledge that courage could survive even in the darkest corners of human cruelty. He lived in the minds of those who survived, in the hope of children who learned that bravery could take many forms. Some remembered him as a man. Others remembered him as a symbol, a blacksmith who had wielded iron not just as a tool, but as an instrument of justice. The Mississippi sun still rose over Natchez. The cane fields still bent under the weight of labor. The sugar mills still ground their endless song of profit. But something had changed. A single act of defiance, executed with patience and precision, had shifted the balance. It reminded everyone, the enslaved and the enslavers alike, that no one was untouchable. No chains were eternal. No cruelty could erase the spark of resistance. Ezekiel's forge, silent now, still spoke. In the rhythm of hammer on iron, in the hiss of hot metal meeting water, there was a story that could not be silenced. It told of a man who waited, who watched, who learned the weight of the tools meant to bind him, and then used them to carve a moment of justice. And that moment became legend, not because it was loud or grandiose, but because it was real, because it carried the weight of suffering and the precision of hope, because it reminded every enslaved person that strength could take root in shadow, in silence, in fire and patience. History often forgets those who lived in the shadows, whose actions left no official mark on books or ledgers. But the legacy of courage persists in other ways. In memory, in story, in the quiet, unyielding defiance that refuses to be erased. Ezekiel's fire burned in that space between oppression and freedom. And it continues to burn whenever someone refuses to bow under chains. Literal or figurative. When we look back at Natchez and the plantations of the South, it is easy to see only wealth and cruelty. But it is also vital to remember those who lived in the shadows, who worked quietly, who understood the value of patience, skill, and strategy. Ezekiel was one such man. He was a blacksmith, yes, but also a teacher of courage, a symbol of the power that lives in those who endure, observe, and act at the right moment. In every strike of hammer on anvil, in every chain forged or broken, in every ember that glows and refuses to die, there is a reminder. Courage can be silent, power can be patient, and justice can take many forms. Ezekiel's story echoes through time, because it is more than a story of revenge. It is a story of hope, resilience, and the human spirit's refusal to be crushed. It reminds us that even in moments of despair, one person, armed with skill, patience, and courage, can turn the instruments of oppression into tools of liberation. Not so. Remember Ezekiel of Natchez. Remember the blacksmith who turned chains against his master. Remember the fire that could not be quenched, the hammer that never faltered, and the quiet courage that changed everything. And if you feel moved by stories like this, stories that reveal forgotten courage and resilience, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Share this story so others can remember the power of patience, fire, and iron. Because history is not just about the powerful, it's about those who dared to rise in the shadows.